everybody. Thank you for coming this evening for the conversation between Lubna Chowdhary and David Batchelor. I'm Ingrid Swenson, I'm the director of Pier. Lubna's exhibition Erratics is going to continue at Pier until the 20th November, and it's been outstandingly received, I have to say. It's brought her work to a range of new audiences, and she's also equally brought many of her loyal audiences to Pier, so it's been a win-win for everybody. It's really great. Lubna and I were very keen to ask David Batchelor to be in conversation with her to discuss various points of intersection of their work, from the use of colour to industrial processes to cultural and artistic influences. David also has associations with Pier, which go back a lot longer, a lot further back. In fact, 20 years ago, when we commissioned him to create a sculptural installation in our offices, at the temporary offices we had at the time at Shoreditch Town Hall, and he also contributed to a large and ambitious publication that we made called Art for All, Their Policies in Our Culture. And that was 20 years ago. So it's great to see you again, though we have seen each other in the interim period. It's going to be a very illuminating evening, I'm sure. I'd like to say a few thanks to those people and organisations who've made the exhibition and this evening possible. Thanks very much to the Arts Council of England, who supported the production of the wooden sculptures in the exhibition, without whom those just simply wouldn't have existed. It's a very ambitious new departure in Lubna's work, which I'm sure she'll talk about a bit more. The Henry Moore Foundation and Very Contemporary as well have supported the project very generously. And Paul and Louise Cook Endowment and also the Pier patrons have also lent their support to the exhibition. The exhibition will be touring to the Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, MIMA, in Middlesbrough in May of next year, where some of the works will be developed further in a sort of expanded form as it's a bigger space. So if you have time next spring to travel to Middlesbrough, it would be a good trip to make, I'm sure.
Thank you, Ingrid, very much. Lubna and I are going to talk for about an hour about a number of subjects we've discussed when we visited each other's studios, and we came across, I think, a few areas where we have quite a lot in common which we wanted to discuss. But just before I begin to do that, I hope you don't mind, I haven't told you this, I just want to briefly remember Achim Burkhardt-Hume, who was a trustee at Pier and and the director of exhibitions at Tate Modern, who died last week. And many of you here will have known Achim and been friends with him. And those of you who didn't know him, you will actually have known him through the many shows he did at Tate Modern and before that at the Whitechapel. So I just wanted to say that, and obviously our thoughts are principally with his family and his colleagues. So Lubna and I are going to attempt to have a really informal conversation with 30 people staring at us. It doesn't usually work. It'll work. I visited Lubna's studio a few weeks ago in anticipation of this talk, and Lubna came to mine, and we had long conversations, out of which I thought there were three main areas that we're going to have a tilt at. One, which will not come as a surprise to any of you, is going to be colour. And in particular, the very different ways in which we use colour, or which colour uses us almost. And then I want to also have a look at the use of found and industrial materials, which is obviously also part of the show at Pier. And then finally, if we have time, to talk about the difference between making your own work in the studio, which we obviously both do the bulk of our time, and having work fabricated, which occasionally we do as well, and just the different protocols and experiences of those different ways of working. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions and conversation, which I hope will spill out easily. So, well, the one thing we obviously have in common is colour in our work. But the one thing that's also very obvious to me is how differently colour is used by each of us in the studios. For example, I use colour very directly. I buy a tin of paint, I open it, I stick it on a surface, that's it. The colour in the tin is pretty much the colour that ends up on the surface of the object. Or I use plastics, or I use adhesive tape, all of which is found and very simply there. It's very unambiguously the colour it's always going to be. However, working with ceramics, which is principally where, not exclusively, but principally where your colour comes from, is an entirely different way of working, where you never know, it seems to me, when you put the colour down, the glaze down on the porcelain or terracotta, you never know when you fire it what it's going to look like. And it seems to me that you have to go through an enormous process of remembering how you made that colour and in order to be able to repeat it and so forth.
Yeah, so I'll talk a bit about that, sort of starting at the beginning at art school, where, you know, I suppose enrolling on a foundation course and working in the ceramics department, there was often a glaze room, and in the glaze room there were buckets of white slop usually, which is glaze, and it's made up of it's usually made from a number of powdered forms, which are then sort of mixed up like a recipe to produce a glaze. And in a way, you know, I suppose each glaze room would probably have about 20 or 30 colours at the most, and you'd have to work within that and work quite blindly. And limited to the colour choices of somebody else, some glaze technician or the department within which you were working. And then over time, I suppose through my ceramics career, I suppose glaze production was sort of industrialised, and imports from America started to come in, and and even though there was this sort of slight, I suppose it's almost like a snobbery between people who mix their own glaze colour and people who buy glaze colour. And buying your glaze colour is sort of slightly going against the...
Which side of the snob thing are you on?
I think definitely on the buying side. But actually, I feel that sort of happened... I suppose I was forced into that position by a friend of mine who I was working with. So I worked with a friend of mine who was a graphic designer at some point, and he worked very much with sort of immediate colour, found colour, or colour that he could download from, you know, a Pantone book or whatever. And he was very, when I worked with him, he was very sort of unobservant of the rules of ceramic. And really encouraged me to work with, because also he wanted to be able to see what he was doing with glaze, whereas I'd sort of just conformed to working blindly and sort of working somewhere between sensation and fact, you know. So you're working with this powdery material, but you're actually very uncertain about what the results are going to be. And so there's a little, actually, can we just, I've got a couple of slides which we didn't talk about the interior. Oh yeah, if we just stop at the next one, Alice. Yeah, that one. Yeah. So these are a few tests that I've done fairly recently, and yeah, I suppose, you know, glaze colour is very elusive. When you're layering glaze colour, it can move a lot during the firing. Sometimes it can just disappear. Sometimes it reacts so strongly with whatever's underneath it that it can change completely.
If anyone's not done any ceramic glazing or underglazing even, the colour of the liquid you stick on which is usually a kind of matte, chalky kind of liquid. Yeah, you can put I mean, I think in fact is like that quite deep maroon there. Yeah. Doesn't that a kind of pink liquid?
Yeah, it's like a pinky liquid.
So you put a pink liquid on it, and then it comes out.
Very deep.
Fundamentally
maroon.
Different.
Yeah. And I suppose here, the reason I put all these mustard pieces in is to just illustrate how elusive the colour, you know, sort of how elusive glaze colour is, because there's a very particular colour that I was trying to achieve with this maroon colour here. But when the piece came out of the firing, for me it was just too waxy, and I'm always looking for a sort of I suppose almost like a sort of real saturation and luminescence in the glaze, and I want it to have some sort of quality, some sort of richness, I suppose. And with this piece, it was just too flat, but we'd actually already glazed this whole section of work with these dots, so we had to try and find a way of changing it. And each experiment we made had to be on a dot exactly the same size. So we went through about 20 or 30 experiments, each time firing the piece for 3 days and not being certain of the results, but then also just doing things like not just trying out different glazes and overlaying them, but also trying out different numbers of layers of glaze, because that will produce a particular effect. And then also some glazes are more fluid than others, so in the firing they can expand and obliterate what's
and they can
gone
also
underneath.
Change the edges, because
Yes.
some of these circles I've seen you put down are they're quite hard edge.
Yeah.
But by the time it's fired,
Exactly.
it's bled and...
Yeah, and then also here you can see that, you know, this piece had been fired about 3 or 4 times in the kiln, but the mustard on these areas, which I haven't touched, is starting to sort of bleed through the maroon glaze, and sort of it's almost like the maroon is disappearing into the mustard. So it's really tricky. It's a really tricky medium to work with.
But even when I'm guessing, even when you found a colour that works for you, and it may have been several different glazes and several firings.
Yeah.
And you've made notes, presumably.
Yes.
Obviously, you have. I know you do. You have to.
Yeah.
And very kind of quite scrupulous notes.
Yeah, I never used to do that. It's only my assistant who has insisted that I do that, because she needs a bit more certainty. Whereas I'm just.
But the question is then, how much certainty do you then have? Does it always come out the same then?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I feel. It depends on the nature of the work that I'm doing. So if it's a commission, for example, and you've shown somebody a sample of work, or a sample of a glaze or a colour, and a texture, then sometimes it's about what they're expecting. Whereas if I'm making work for myself, so for example some of the pieces in the exhibition, then I'll be much freer about it and less constrained, and much happier to go with the nature of the glaze and all the accidents, and sometimes happy accidents that happen, you know, and then other times disasters that then you have to try and rectify. And sometimes I will keep working on a piece, but obviously, you know, over time all sorts of stresses and strains work into the piece, and often it'll just crack after 20 firings or whatever, you know, when you're really sort of persisting with
20 firings?
You could do on a you know, if you've got sometimes, I mean, if it doesn't crack, I mean, all sorts of stresses and strains break up, sort of start to build up in the work. So sometimes you can just keep going and going, but then also the layers of glaze build up because it's actually got a thickness to it. Yeah. And so that can cause problems as well. Not that I would ever do 20 firings, that was an exaggeration, but I might do 10, you know, at an extreme.
But you know, the works in the show, the larger works, they're multi-piece works. Yeah. So I presume you want to make sure that the colours on each section... Yeah, and that can be very problematic. Coordinate. Yeah, because again, there's all sorts of ways that glaze will behave according to which part of the kiln you put it in. So at the moment, I'm trying to work on a red piece that has probably about 10 or 12 tiles around it in red glaze, but the red pieces can only be fired at a particular position in the kiln because that's where the optimum temperature is. So the rest of the kiln has to be filled with other work. So it's just, sometimes if you're working on a large panel and, you know, the colours, if you're not worried about the colours matching up, then it's not a problem. It can actually make the work more interesting. But occasionally you're searching for consistency, and then that's when all that
all those complexities come into play in terms of firing, temperatures and layering.
I'm just so glad I'm not a ceramicist.
Yeah, I wish I wasn't a ceramicist sometimes, and I sometimes think, oh yeah, it's such an unpredictable material that I do often wish I just worked with textiles.
But I mean, having emphasised how methodical you clearly have to be, but at the same time, you obviously are open to mistakes and improvisations on things that don't turn out like they're meant to. Yeah,
definitely. Because there's a lot of guesswork in, as I said. I mean, I always, I suppose it's only recently, since I've had an assistant, that I've started to make those meticulous notes. And before then, it was almost, it sort of, I'd always just work very intuitively with the glaze, and sort of what you end up doing is carrying a memory almost of what the glaze will do, how it will perform. And now, obviously, with the use of industrial glazes, because I'm not mixing my own anymore, I've probably got about 200 glazes, not 20, 200 glazes, and each of those, I have a sense of what they're going to do in the kiln, how they're going to interact with whatever's underneath, how, and also which order I would use them in. So whether I use them as a base glaze or whether I use them as a detail on the surface. So it's a matter of choosing the colour, thinking about how they're going to perform texturally, but also at what whether they're better as a base glaze or a final detail, all that sort of thing comes into it.
This has just made me think a bit more about your studio and the way you work. And there's a very old-fashioned opposition in art about disegno versus colore, design versus colour. Yeah. It goes right back. Well, arguably it goes back to Aristotle, but and there's a tradition in the West that maintains that drawing precedes colour. Colour is colouring in. Drawing is where the thinking goes on, where the abstract thinking goes on, and colouring is just mimetic. It's just. Yeah. What is that? How is that relationship organised? Because there's some very strong design elements, shapes and forms in your work. Yeah. And we've only talked about the colour. I'm just wondering about that relationship between the two.
Yeah, I suppose over time I've developed this sort of quite. I suppose it's a sort of hybrid visual iconography, and I've worked on that. Both through drawing, but then, and then that drawing, I suppose if I'm talking technically about the work, how it develops technically, so then there's a process of researching, thinking, drawing, gathering information, and then usually that's translated into an Illustrator file. So there might be sort of quite simple forms that are translated into an Illustrator file, and then that's generally, there's a technical process that then comes into play where the drawing is sent off to a waterjet cutter and the tile forms then are cut using sort of quite complex waterjet cutting technology. So
which makes them incredibly accurate. So they're going to join together.
And then there's always this sort of combination of the technological with the manual and sort of quite fluid sort of hand glazing with this sort of very sort of sharp and precise edge. And that's something that I'd always sought in the work, because I felt. I suppose I started life as, or my education has been very much within craft and within handmaking, and I felt that, throughout my education, I sort of always had this fascination, and I found, I suppose, the world of design and industry very seductive, but couldn't ever find a way of accessing it. And it's only later on in life, through sort of collaborations and then, trying to find new ways of working with modular materials like tile, that has allowed me to enter the world, this modern world of sort of technology and industry, and work and it's usually the commissioned work that's taken me in that direction. Yeah.
You said to me in the studio that you made a decision at some point you're not going to do vessels, which ceramicists, ceramics sort of off. I mean, the history of ceramics is the history often of vessels of one kind or another. Yeah. And you said you were just going to work on flat planes.
Yeah. I mean, I think let me think, how did that come about? Yeah, so I suppose I worked very directly. So I think initially I worked very directly with the clay, making sculptural objects. And these were sort of very much informed by anthropological collections rather than the history of ceramics. So objects that I'd seen in collections like the Pitt Rivers or the Museum of Mankind, or even Manchester Museum had a small anthropological collection. And so I never, there was never really a point where I was making vessels, although my training in ceramics at Manchester, for example, there was a large part of it which was about throwing pots and developing those skills. And then I suppose I felt that the work, the sculptural work, at the time, this is probably about the late 80s, early 90s, there was no I felt that there was no real engagement with the work. It was a sort of very unfamiliar form, and because I was working on multi-object pieces that were very small, and I usually displayed them on the floor, and they made references to sort of I suppose the built environment and human production and the man-made world, and there was no sort of connection with the history of ceramics in England. And as I said earlier, that I felt that there was a real lack of engagement or understanding of the work because it was so unfamiliar. So at that point, I just put the work aside, and that sculptural work aside, and thought about how I could make work that was more accessible to wider audiences, but then also that could exist outside of the gallery context, because I felt that it was the crafts world at the time was a very narrow and undiverse world, and I wanted to be able to work outside of that. So I thought about ways of applying the skills I had to a method of working which could be integrated into the built environment and to become part of people's everyday experience and be experienced in quite a sort of, just an incidental way, and that's when I started working with tile. But also it sort of satisfied that fascination with wanting to work in architecture, because there's a long history of tile both in the West and in the East, and tile seemed also like a ready vehicle for the application of ornament and colour, and it really opened out ways of working which included working with technology, working with modular materials, and really opening out colour work as well.
Yeah, because having said that, a large part of the history of ceramics is the history of vessels, the other half of it is the history of architecture and tile work. And as you say, both in Eastern cultures and in the West. And for me, some of the richest examples that come to mind of colour and ceramics are precisely in that area. It also got me. I was using that to angle away because I want to talk briefly about shelves.
Shelves, okay.
Because we both done shelves, and I think personally, I think one of the works that I found most striking in your exhibition, the one up here, what are they called, tableaus? Those two long shelves with multiple flat-shaped, vividly coloured elements. I'm not going to say scattered across them, but laid across them in an informal way. And I have a theory about theory is typically a word. I have an idea, a notion about why shelves might be interesting to both of us. And one of them is that to put something on a shelf, it's both touching the ground and it's touching the wall. In that sense, it's sort of between the space of painting and the space of sculpture, and it's 2.5 dimensional work, I think, and I found that incredibly useful area to explore, because I've never been certain whether I'm principally making 3-dimensional work or 2-dimensional work. So if you do 2.5, you kind of and it seems that you would, in that you are doing 2.5 dimensional work, and
I mean, it was interesting coming to your studio, because I sort of felt that you used shelves in a slightly different way to me.
No, I do completely.
I mean, I sort of felt that you. I think we both talked about the way that incidental things happened on shelves.
Yes.
And I feel that I've really run with that incidental. Whereas I think in your studio, what was quite interesting is that you're, I mean, I think maybe some of the smaller tableau pieces, there's a similarity where I've grouped objects together into smaller groupings and then displayed them, whereas you've got singular.
Back in the day, I did make works where it was several layers of actually painted plexiglass were sort of stacked up together on as a work. What you saw in the studio was actually more my kind of office archive. There's a space in my studio where I've got lots of shelves with objects on them, which actually are both maquettes and found objects and drawings, and there's a space where all sorts of different things can cohabit. Whereas in a way, usually in a studio or even in a gallery, the paintings and the sculptures tend to get separated out, or and so forth, and the archival material. It all tends to get sort of isolated, and the pleasure for me is just it's a space where I don't have to worry about what it is. It's I mean, I sort of feel that my work, I suppose the shelf-based works, it was again one of those sort of happy accidents, because usually when I'm working on a panel, a tile panel, for example, or any project, there's usually work that's either left over or things that haven't quite worked that I've had to repeat, and so they all get put to one side. But then also, I when I first fitted out the studio, I put in 2 shelves for all my glaze samples, and the glaze samples were quite small, but then eventually they became larger and larger, and that's when all those sort of quite chance juxtapositions of things started to happen, and that's where the sort of I suppose it was a combination of wanting to move away from just talking about the tableau works in the studio. It was a combination of that sort of chance piling up of objects, but also wanting to move away from the grid, the underlying grid of the tile work that I was working on. So, and then I started to use the industrial cutting methods to make more and more complex pieces. So then the composition started to become a bit more interesting. The iconography, the sort of the iconography of the form started to become more interesting. So instead of just being rectangles, it was almost like a sort of like a vocabulary of forms, which then I just sort of built on. But I have to say, I was sort of still trapped in ceramic thinking mode. I never started to really think about it in terms of sculpture or drawing until fairly recently, and now there seems to be this sort of oscillating between drawing and panel, tiles that are actually adhered to wooden panels, and then the stacked up works, and then finally moving back into 3-dimensional work again. I mean, the one thing it speaks of is that the importance of the studio accident, and peripheral vision. That there's what you're focusing on doing, and there's what you're putting to the side because it's not quite what you had in mind. And then there's a certain point where you keep looking aside and noticing that what you're putting aside is actually in a way more interesting than what you're making, and then you have to accommodate that and work with it. And my feeling is that those shelves, they seem to come out of all exactly what you describe, and it also means they have a kind of looseness about them. They could be, even if you want them exactly in that arrangement, there's still this sort of sense that things could be moved around. Whereas in a gridded panel, like on the timber back, that is much more fixed, obviously.
I mean, I think if we just Alice, if we just move on to the next, yeah. So this is just an image of how that something like that panel would evolve. So I would work on a number of forms in the studio. So each of these would be waterjet cut and then taken back to the studio, and over time sort of work quite intuitively with colour and just really enjoying it rather than planning it at all. And really thinking just about composing colour within the confines of that individual object. And then eventually, when I've got about sort of 30, 40 or 100 of them, just to get them all out and have a day of playing and composing in a very unplanned and intuitive way. And stacking things up and then endlessly, you know, and the thing is, the slightly frustrating thing is when you've got so many of these objects that actually you feel as though there's always some magic combination that you might have missed, but eventually you feel, you know,
eventually you get bored with it and you're tired.
You do, and then there are deadlines to sort of
there are deadlines. But it also, I have to say, it looks incredibly pleasurable.
Yeah, it is really nice. It's a lovely, you know, it's sort of going back through work and remembering how things were made and sort of slightly recognising like beautiful combinations of glaze that you didn't take the notes for, that you would never ever be able to recreate. So all that, and then sort of sometimes you'll find pieces and you just think, why on earth did I do that? But it's actually very successful, and just sort of go with it. So yeah, it is just really, I think these are some of the most playful works because they're that really lovely combination of just utter intuition and intuitive play in the studio, but then also there's that sort of technological element where, you know, it starts off with a very particular shaped, almost like a canvas that you're working with, and then, it sort of remains fluid right up to the composer.
And it can become fluid again. I mean, I started making works made out of several different elements, and thinking that when they get to the gallery, that's when they find their shape and their arrangement. But then when they go to somewhere else, they can be configured differently. And that made me think, I can make. That would look like I've made 5 works. I've actually only made 1. I've just displayed them differently. It would make my career look so much richer.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because that's how I think it's interesting that sort of that modularity and thinking about how fluid a work can be has sort of, in a way, it sort of flowed through to pieces like the rope work, for example, and there's that silver lagging piece.
Well, I mean, that's exactly what I think we should be talking about now, perhaps.
Okay, yeah. So, so that work, the rope work and the lagging. So obviously I've worked with modularity in tile, but last year I did a residency in Sweden at a place called Jaspis, and when I arrived there, I was just presented with a white, empty studio, no facilities for making and no technical equipment to make anything or materials. So it was just an empty space, and I had to find materials to work with. And I ended up, so to find materials, I ended up going to the hardware shops. They had these enormous and beautiful hardware shops in Sweden called Bauhaus, and they were actually even styled on the Bauhaus school. So, and there were these really cavernous spaces that were just absolutely full of, I mean, in a way, they were almost like anthropological collections because they were so specific in some areas to Sweden. You know, there was lots of timber, and then there was endless amounts of rope because lots of people had ropes, and obviously there's a tradition of self-building and a boat, lots of people had boats, not rope.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you go to someone Swedish, you go to their garage, it's full of rope.
Sorry, yeah. And so, and then what was quite nice was also that there was space in the DIY stores to just make work on the floor. So you could sort of begin work there, then buy it and take it home in a bag and carry on, you know. So, so
I fancy my chances there at Jewson's or, was it Travis Perkins?
No, not at all. Yeah, everything's behind the counter now. I went to a hardware shop in a while ago. I can't remember which one it was, Travis Perkins or something, and everything is just behind the counter. You can't touch or feel anything, which is really disappointing.
It must be, I mean, it's a radically different way of working than the ceramics, which are so slow and planned and methodical. I mean, this is found material that you can arrange literally on the floor of the hardware store.
Yeah, it is very radically different, but I sort of feel that lots of ways of working sort of still permeate. So there's, I suppose, just going back to the modularity and the continual versatility of the forms, and the fact that actually it can be configured and reconfigured. So with the silver lagging piece, for example, it's been designed or conceived in such a way that it can come apart and be reconfigured. And what I loved about it is that it's just got this incredible system that comes with it of racking clips that hold it all together, and then there's tape that you can use to just joint the lagging sections, and at any point you can disassemble it and reassemble it in a new place and add to it, and it can expand or contract into a space. So that's something that I thought quite carefully about when conceiving the space. And I think that's sort of also come out of having a long sort of history of working to commission with architects or making site-specific works, where you're constantly thinking about the relationship of surface and form and the relationship of the work that you're making to architecture.
And in one instance, at least in the gallery, you've combined ceramics with some rope.
Yeah.
Is that the first time you've done that?
Yeah, it is the first time I've done it. I mean, in the Swedish studio, what I did was so I suppose one of the reasons I'll explain why I started using rope, actually, because I didn't talk about that. So what I wanted to do in the Swedish studio was to find a material that I could draw onto the wall with, but not a conventional drawing material. So I bought these enormous reels of rope and then just started to think about ways that I could sort of pin the rope onto the walls and just draw with that and have a sort of continuous line without sort of cutting, stopping and starting. So that's where the rope work came from. And then once I'd produced these sort of expansive wall drawings using rope, then I started to sort of focus in again and make small rope type objects on the wall, and needed some templates to work around. So I just disassembled the reels that the rope came on, and the ends of the reels were these sort of two enormous red plastic discs, and pinned those into the wall. But then obviously here I wanted to refine that a little bit, and just came across, I mean, it was an accident that I just had these 4 circles that just happened to be the right size sitting around in the studio, 2 of which were glazed and 2 weren't, so I just glazed the others, and then they did the job for the templates to for the rope to work around.
So on paper, the idea of combining a multiply glazed ceramic tile and this store-bought synthetic coloured rope seems on paper it doesn't work.
No.
But then the pleasure of it is that it actually in the studio and the gallery they sit together very well, I think.
I mean, I sort of feel that in the exhibition I've had I suppose it doesn't work on paper, but I felt that I had to see what happened with it, because I think what I've learned from the Swedish residency is that sometimes you just have to try things out, and you just have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and even though it's aesthetically awkward, the combinations are aesthetically awkward, that actually you just have to go with it. And I think that's the nature of the work that I make. It's quite often there's always a sort of a reaction against making sort of pleasing, conformative objects, you know. So it's, I suppose in ceramics, it's moving away from making vessels, and with tile, it's sort of cutting, sort of moving away from the grid. And with rope, there are so many other ways of working with rope that are more conventional, like weaving or plaiting or knotting, and they were all things that I was aware of, but I just wanted to, I suppose I felt as though what I was doing was very, very simple, just coiling, you know. Maybe there's a connection with clay there, I don't know. But yeah,
I think that moment in the studio of like, you know, I'm not sure what I'm doing. I don't even like the look of what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I don't know where it's going, but I've got to keep doing it.
Yeah.
I think that's I mean, it's a difficult moment because it, in a way, everything rational and logical is telling you to stop and go and do what you know you can do. But there's that sense you've got to overcome that resistance to change and see what happens. And sometimes, in my experience, sometimes absolutely nothing comes out of it. Yeah. But quite often, in fact. But then when something does come out of it, it's something you've not been able to imagine or anticipate. So in a way, it's the materials are instructing you rather than you instructing the materials. And that seems to me a good place to be, is to be learning from the stuff that you're trying to manipulate.
Yeah, and I feel that a lot of there's a lot of new work in the exhibition that, you know, work that people have been not expecting, because obviously I've got a long history of working in ceramics, and I feel like I'm just at the beginning of something that's quite uncomfortable, and I suppose you're right. Also it's just about pushing on with it and just continuing that exploration and seeing.
Let's just sort of shift slightly and one of the other elements of the exhibition are works that you've not made yourself. Well, the larger final forms of the works you've not made yourself, and you know, either in the studio or in out in the hardware store, which are the larger timber, very, very well crafted timber pieces based on small clay structures that you've made yourself. Again, we talked about that in our studios a bit. The difference between making something that, and everything that goes with it, the failures, the discoveries, the improvisations, the looking at it. And when you have something manufactured, in my experience, you essentially you lose all of that. And I often find it quite difficult to know what to do with something when it's been manufactured, because it comes back and you think, well, you literally think, well, who made that? But then, I mean, do you find that in... How did you find the that manufacturing process?
Well, I mean, it's quite interesting. For me, it's one of the first times I've actually had something fabricated, and the Arts Council grant enabled me to do that. But I sort of feel that the route to fabrication has been sort of lots of slow, steady steps. So usually, in the craft world, there's this real emphasis on making things yourself, and I've been slightly trapped by that over the years, and felt as though whatever I conceived, I had to try and make it myself, and that was sort of slightly limiting. And then starting to work to commission with architects and interior designers and do the public artworks, for example, really freed me. Well, it didn't really free me up, but I suppose. What ended up happening was that the architects became almost like the conduits to production. So I think I was talking to my friend Michelle earlier on about sort of sites of industry and manufacture and technology in this country, and actually any country, and how difficult they are for women, for example. But then also particularly for a woman of colour, because I have felt very inhibited about building those relationships, or being comfortable about building those relationships. So it has been steady steps, and a lot of the access to fabrication has been through architects, usually male architects, putting me in touch with manufacturers, and then the conversation has quite often happened through them. And this is the first time that I was able to, I suppose, with the weight of a big pot of money, and also, I suppose, yeah, with, 20 years of experience behind me, go to a fabricator and interest them in collaborating with me very directly. So the question was, sorry, what was the question?
No idea.
It
was how different?
How do I fabricate? Oh yeah.
How different do you fabricate?
Yeah, I feel that it wasn't. I felt that there was a long working out process with the wooden objects. That first of all, there was a sort of real intuitive process where I'm making objects on my desk in the studio or on my work table in the studio, and there it's a very intuitive process because the distance between thinking and making is basically the length of your arm, so it's just very short and really immediate. And then once I've got a number of objects, what I did was I selected from those, drew them with my assistant Michelle. I worked them up onto a much larger scale, sort of human scale, and then again drew, took photographs, carried on drawing, and then by the time I went to the fabricators, I had this whole range of materials, so visualizations, technical drawings, small models, and that made everything much easier for them. Plus, we worked on, so with the fabricators, they're actually also craftspeople, and they really understood, I suppose we understood each other on some more complex level than if I'd maybe just gone to a factory, for example. So we had this sort of feasibility period where we worked out problems, any problems that might arise, and they did some sampling, and actually it was a very straightforward project. So I felt as though I got almost exactly what I wanted with the work, but also I felt as though I had had a real input in it. So it wasn't a very sterile process. Right. I felt much more connected to the work, and I actually feel it's my work still, even though somebody else has made it. And I thought that would be I'd feel very detached from that because it is the first time that I've ever gone to a maker or a fabricator with something that's very personal to me, whereas in the past it's been a commission project. Yeah.
Didn't you? I think you said to me that your initial plan, disrupted by COVID, was you'd actually have them made them in India. Yeah. And which obviously then opens up a whole another subject in a way. Well, no, part of the same subject, which is about. I think you've described yourself as a kind of hybrid being. Yeah. I mean, maybe for the last part of our conversation before we open to questions, but be more about your understanding of that relationship between your past and your present in India and your past and your present in the UK.
Yeah, so the wooden objects came out of research that I'd conducted at the V&A during my residency there, and I came across these objects that were hybrid objects made between cultures. So they were commissioned by Europeans who couldn't take their own furniture objects to India, and then over there they'd had to commission furniture or larger objects that they couldn't ship. And in that commissioning, there resulted this sort of quite convoluted aesthetic language, and then also a real sort of slippage in terms of functionality and different histories of the body and ergonomics within the work. And when I saw these objects, I recognised something in them that was very familiar and very similar to the work that I had been creating in the past. And and it was something that I felt as though, I felt at the time that I wanted to do something with this sort of work forwards with this body of work. And and also that, I suppose that familiarity. There's a level of familiarity about being between cultures, sort of moving between countries, and experiencing things. Say, for example, I was born in Tanzania, and so there's that transition from Tanzania to England, and then moving backwards and forwards to places like India or Pakistan, and experiencing different ways of living there. So that was sort of very much part of my experience, and I wanted to really play with recreating that experience, that, I suppose, mimicking that production between cultures, and and commissioning an Indian craftsman and seeing what the results of that conversation could be. You know, being a hybrid person myself and taking my own hybrid aesthetic to another culture, and trying to sort of explore what would happen, and seeing how that could become indicative of the more I suppose the complex global world that we live in, you know, where we're bombarded with information from all corners of the world, and how that could say something about how the objects could say something about the complexity of the world that we live in. And so the Indian collaboration didn't happen because of COVID, although I did have some 1/3 scale models built and sent over. So I commissioned two it's difficult to call them craftsmen because they were just like jobbing carpenters. So they are craftsmen, but not in the European sense. So that was quite interesting because obviously they weren't interested in, it's a very different relationship to the commission in England, because the people I worked with here had an identity of their own that they were very protective of, whereas the people in India didn't really care about that so much. And I had to work hard to get information about them as individuals. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with that information, but I did eventually get some nice photographs of them in the workshop. And so eventually, because of COVID, I couldn't make the work in India and ended up finding a craftsperson here, Jan Hensel's studio, they're called, and I collaborated with them to make the work.
Okay. I think, as promised, I'm going to open this up to anyone to ask something or say something or walk out angrily. It's entirely up to you. There will now be a statutory minute silence.
I was wondering, David, if you'd like to show some of your images.
Please do.
Okay.
Particularly
that's Luminous. Okay, these are the two shelf images. So just go back to the previous one. So that's obviously as you see in the gallery, and that very much. I mean that's the sort of office part of my studio, so basically it has very early drawings. Actually, my first ever colour sculpture, some pre-colour work, and then about 10, 12 years ago, I realised that I could stick things in concrete, and originally just bits of broken glass, and now I realise I can stick almost anything in concrete. And so some of which these are the tops of tins of paint, which for years I've been using tins of paint and when the tin was empty, chucking away the top, and then realising later in the day that actually I was throwing away again the most interesting bit, which was these lids. And this was one of the paintings which it derives from. Some drawings, some plates that I had made. Go up that way. A bit of lapis lazuli. Things. So most of these things they're not work. They're just what are they? I don't even know what I did. Some of these are little paper maquettes for a commission that never happened. I mean, I could have a very large show of unmade work, if you see. I mean, insofar as I made maquettes for commissions which never came to bear. Objects from junk shops, folding rulers, and the shelf is just this in a way, for me, the perfect vehicle for these different things simply to sit together. They're not intended to go together, but they kind of, I suppose they aid my thinking. I seem to need to have a lot of stuff around me in the studio from the past and from the present. And
I think that's what was quite interesting about visiting your studio, that it was almost like your whole thought process was laid bare in the studio.
Yeah.
And you know, from your points, like you say about collecting and making.
Homage to Malevich at the top there. One of my many homages to Malevich, actually. Yeah, it's I
think it was all there, whereas mine's sort of just much more of a functional, you know, making it studio. So yeah, it's such a pleasure to see all the objects that you've sort of been collecting, like your beaded necklaces and
that's which you can't see there. Yeah, I mean, there's a few strung over this piece of wire there. I mean, essentially, I'm anything that's vividly colourful, that's abstractly interesting and has good shapes in it and is flat, is going to be interesting. So actually I found increasingly that things like textiles and beadwork and such like in terms of the studio of a more of an informative and than anything else. And then obviously, I mean, I think again it's very interesting that you're showing now at the moment at a time where it seems that thankfully some of the more sort of old-fashioned divisions between so-called craft and so-called fine art have broken down, and then there are more artists using ceramics and textiles working, and it seems to me that the sort of interplay between different traditions and different mediums is entirely productive and welcome. And I think it's freed people up a lot.
I think so, yeah, definitely. I mean, I sort of feel, like 10 years ago, I couldn't have imagined this leap to working predominantly in ceramics to then
That's you talked about some mediated colour. I mean, this is immediate colour. This is, I mean, just adhesive tape. I don't even have to get glue. It's adhesive tape. It's some of it's incredibly vividly. I mean, some of it's shiny and reflective. Others are these ones for vehicles, which have this sort of semi-reflective quality. I mean, that's my hardware store moment. That's my version of your rope, and it's just very fast. I mean, they're fast colours in the sense that they seem to be very immediate colours in the sense that they're very simple colours. I think, which again is rather different from the richness and the density of yours, I think.
It was interesting to see your glaze experiments. When I maybe you can talk about those.
One day there's some ceramicists in the studio block I'm in, and because I'd lent them some tools, they offered me a kind of day trying out ceramics. It was a long day, but I mean, I just found the whole. I thought, great, I can do some. I can adapt some of these. Works I've been making into tiles. That'd be great, but it was so complex. First of all, they made me, make my own tiles. So you had to, get the porcelain and roll it out, and then you have to biscuit fire it. And then you get it back, and then you try all these underglaze. I was doing underglazes rather than glazes. You paint them on, and they come out completely different colours, or some of them don't come out any colour at all.
But I think the answer for you then is to just use ready-made tile, because there's because I feel there's a whole world of to be explored in modular tile and visiting sort of B&Q or Tile Giant or whatever.
I was involved. I made a proposal for a commission, oddly enough, in the same building in Liverpool Street where you successfully got a commission. The people upstairs obviously had considerably less insight than the people downstairs. No, you're right. I'd love to. I've for many years actually, I've really wanted to do a large modular tile work. And that's partly because of certainly interest in Latin American tile work, and particularly Brazilian modernist tile work when they worked with the architects, and essentially when they're literally building, modern Brazil, so to speak, but also the tile work I've seen in Iran and in Granada and in Spain. I mean, this is some of the most vivid, brilliant, inventive art I've ever seen. And the amazing thing about ceramic colour is, of course, it's pretty permanent. Unlike almost all other forms of colour, it's what was maybe made in 1200 years ago in Isfahan is probably pretty much what you can see now in terms of its colour, which is extraordinary. No, I would love to, and there's a lot of modularity and a lot of grids in my stuff, even though I try as much as I can to hide them, or to get over them. But no, I would absolutely love to do a large-scale mural of tiles. I came quite close. I got gazumped by someone who does illustrations in black and white.
That's what happens to quite a lot of my public art projects as well, that they call you in because they love your colour use, and then you end up having to produce it. It sort of gets steadily bleached, all the colour gets steadily bleached out, so at the end of the project you're producing something that's really aseptic and neutral, and but I mean, if one is involved in this kind of commissioning process, it's inevitable that most of what you propose doesn't end up getting made, and that's obviously frustrating at times. But also, my feeling is always that it still feeds into the studio, and it's not wasted work. And thankfully, I feel as
at least I have to tell myself that on a regular basis.
I think every commission that I work on, it pushes the work in new directions and enables just sort of technical leaps forward, or
leaps of scale too. Because I found that you can't make anything bigger than your studio door, really, can you?
No. Well, I sort of feel I can because I'm working with tile and it's modular, and I can work.
Some of my sculpture stuff is flat pack as well, so you can assemble it elsewhere. But I think there's sometimes a commission that both the financing of it, but also the placing of it can mean you can make something considerably larger than and that's always helpful and interesting and so on. Go on, your turn, please.
Could you talk, Lubna, a little bit about your painting and your collage practice as well? Because I think really they're very related to your work in ceramics in some ways.
They are. So I think when you talked, David, about the shelf pieces being between sculpture and drawing, is that right? Drawing and painting. Yeah, sculpture and painting. Yeah, I feel that the painting works and the collage works are also, there's a sort of real relationship in many directions with those. So with the painting works, for example, they've definitely come out of the technical sort of leap that I've made with the tile work. So with the tile work, what I tried to do eventually was to sort of reject the grid, so still work with the geometry, but actually move away and develop a new iconography of form or shape, and while I was in Sweden, and then that fed into the larger tile panels, and then from the tile panels, then that fed back into the painting. So instead of sort of just working on, taking a blank canvas and working on it, I use the same technology where you're drawing in Illustrator and then feeding into a cutting machine. So with the tile, it's usually feeding into a water jet cutter, but this time the drawn line was then fed into a laser cutter. And so I suppose the canvas is then sent back to me as a number of, almost like a sort of small jigsaw. So there's a real relationship with the tile work, and then each of the pieces initially is painted individual colours, but then once the whole sort of jigsaw, so to speak, is put together, then there's a process of sort of working over and disrupting and obliterating some of the lines and sort of hiding the underlying sort of cut. And then also there's a sort of also, while I was in Sweden, one of the other things that I found to work with, which was just very sort of cheap, ubiquitous, just coloured stickers. So it's sort of trying to find an industrial module or an industrially made module, but again, applying a manual process to it. So it's sort of taking just ordinary stickers, hand painting them all, and then using them to create sort of quite grid-like. So there's always an underlying geometry to the work. I like the sort of the discipline and the mathematics involved in sort of spacing the modules and overlapping them and sort of almost forming sort of screens which then create new patterns when you overlay them.
Technical interference patterns.
Yeah, something like that. But you're doing, but I'm doing it manually rather than through a.
But I think that's. I mean, I think the question about collage is germane, because I think that the even if they aren't actual collages, the sort of the collage process is somehow very much a part of the work. That you end up sticking things together and overlaying things, and even if they're not literally cut out bits from magazines or whatever in the old sense of collage. Things are assembled, whether they're paintings or they're sculptures or they're, and I think I feel very much the same about my stuff. May not be an actual collage, but the sort of the ethos of collage underlines it. And also I think with you talk about your interest in geometry and your commitment to it, but it's also disrupting the geometry by the hand paintedness of it or handmadeness of it is putting in a sort of variation, difference where in a context of sameness and also sort of sameness in the context of difference. I think that's what I like about the beadwork I've been collecting too. It's they're very geometric shapes, but there's always disruptions within them. And when you're working with something geometric, you don't have to do much to disrupt it, because it's such a regular form. You don't have one misplaced bead throws open the whole thing. I think that's something I'm sure in your work as well, that it's that sort of that sort of incidental, sort of accidental, the glitch in the glaze, something. Not being able to mix the right tone again when I'm hand painting the stickers, or all that. That's the thing that sort of humanises the work, because there's always that. It's taking it away from the industrial, and even with the wooden works, that was something that I was very conscious of, that it should be a combination of industrial and manual process, and it was really important to find somebody that worked both with sort of CNC cutting and routing and so on, but also had the skills to hand finish the work. And we work quite carefully to try and disrupt the regularity, even though there's a lot of sort of grid, there's a lot of grid-like detailing in the work. There's very subtle variations that we worked back into not just manually, but sort of into the computerized cutting of the work, but then also into the hand finishing. Just to. Another question, please. Yes.
It's again going back to the idea in between. When you mentioned that, if the work is not a sculpture and not a painting, something in between, I had a sort of a body, but fragile body, and I wanted to ask you if you think this way about your work somehow, because it's the object that needs holding or support in a way.
Which objects are you talking about?
Your shelves.
Oh yeah, Yeah, okay. Whether I think of them as needing supporting.
What do you feel about this position? I don't know, like in between us holding, standing, or like support. I mean, and generally, like the relationship maybe towards the body.
I suppose I think of them as quite inanimate objects and not necessarily, not necessarily related to the body, because I feel that I've never made work that relates to the figurative, and I've always been much more interested in human production and
built environment.
Yeah, the built environment, and and what human beings can make rather than what human beings contain, sort of spiritually or sensually. So yeah, I mean, I think I definitely think of them as emotionless objects. So yeah. It sounds a bit harsh to say, but because other people do read a lot into the work and try and find. I think each of the pieces on the shelf piece, for example, they're quite suggestive, but usually suggest. Sometimes people read the figurative into them, but I feel for me they're much more about the built environment and human production and the man-made world and what we create and leave behind.
But you say emotionless.
Yeah.
But they're not. But I wouldn't call them cold.
No, they're not cold.
So metaphorically, they're warm. And that's
they're not cold.
They're not heartless, are they?
No. I mean, it's quite interesting because one of the things I did want to say, this is probably not relating to your question at all, but I was thinking about colour earlier on, and you were sort of saying that this work is not cold and it's not heartless, and I was sort of thinking about what it is to be a person of colour using colour, and it's something that we haven't really sort of touched on, and I feel that it's something that it's a line that I've sort of trodden quite carefully, because you've written a lot, David, about the sort of colour hierarchies and the way that colour is perceived, and I feel
in the West.
Yes, yeah, and I feel that in the West and through my education also that I've had to be quite careful not to become a sort of slight caricature of myself or to self-orientalise, because I think there's always a danger if you're using a lot of colour as a person of colour that you can be relegated to the realms of like jolly folk art or something,
and the exotic and all sorts of stuff.
So
it's much easier for me. I'm not kidding.
No, I think it is.
The last thing anyone would expect me to do is to work with vivid colour. Yeah. Because of my background, and I mean, I was taught by a tribe of conceptual artists who themselves said that colour was kryptonite to them. Yeah. So in a way, it was the last thing that was in a way expected of someone like me from my educational background and my cultural background. But whereas, no, I entirely think for you, but it's a much more complex issue. Yeah. Ironically, in some respects.
Yeah, and I think, so that's, I suppose, it's very easy for people to compartmentalize you in particular ways, and so. I think over the years, I've had this sort of love-hate relation, even though my work is now really colour-rich. And, one of the things, I've had this sort of veering backwards and forwards from being, sort of, I suppose, in my RCA days, trying to conform and be sort of very neutral in my palette and avoid colour. And then eventually just embracing it and just going with it. But so one of the things that I really loved in your chronology, the Whitechapel one, the writings, was something that Yinka Shonibari wrote about about his subversive use of colour and how he uses colour almost like a colour insult to people with so-called good taste. And I feel that really made me laugh, and I felt like, oh yeah, it's a really good way of thinking about it and actually just owning it and just getting on with it.
I can't remember the detail of that now, but I do remember that Yinka wrote very elegantly, I thought, very subtly about that, because very aware of exactly the things that you're describing. It was like the funniest
piece of writing in the book, I thought. But anyway.
The intentionally, there's some unintentionally funny stuff in the book too, but that was absolutely. More, please.
So I was just because the colour pieces obviously are stealing the show from the grey and glazed pieces
that's true.
in the exhibition, and I found them fascinating. I don't know, maybe I completely misread them, but they appear as this kind of sculpture, but also models of some theatre models or something utilitarian. These sort of speculative design pieces which draw sort of different traditions, perhaps, or sort of twist things, or sort of memories. And I found them. How do you see them, and how do you make them?
Okay, so they're the one. So when I was talking about the wooden pieces earlier on, and I talked about making very directly at my desk in the studio, so those pieces are very intuitive, and I feel that it's very important to have that process of thinking and making very intuitively in the studio, and then drawing out from those objects. So in the past, I haven't been able to do that drawing out process because the work didn't really have anywhere to go. So with those works, it's almost like a sort of an information dump of references. So in those works, there's references to micro-architecture, to furniture, to the built environment, to what else? To design, to craft, to different histories of the body. So with those small black works, I was thinking very much about furniture-based objects. They came out of the V&A research. And even things like, so this is a funny little anecdote. So when we first came to England, for example, we came from Tanzania, and
just for information, what sort of age would you have been?
Five,
okay.
yeah. So, and my father went out. We thought we had a house with an outdoor toilet. So there's a long yard with a toilet at the end of it. And we all thought that we would be snowed in because we'd never experienced snow. And so my dad went out and he bought a commode, which was like a throne, okay? And we put it and he bought it home on the bus because we didn't have a car. And we put it in the cellar, and we had it there all the time that we lived in this house. But of course we never used it because we just thought, we'd rather like make our way out to the outdoor loo. But of course we never got snowed in. But that's what we thought we had to have. And I remember that process of moving to this country, and there being all sorts of discussions about what we would need, what tools for living we would need. And the commode was one of them. And then it was other things like vests.
Snow shovels.
Vests and knives and forks, which again we never used because we just carried on living in the way that we were living. But also, I had the same experience going to Pakistan, for example, so I'll just talk a little bit about the objects that I looked at in the V&A. So one of the pieces I really loved that was a really early piece of furniture that was made between cultures was a daybed. And so of course Europeans wanted to have a place where they could have a nap in the day, and it was elevated. So this daybed was elevated sleeping area, whereas of course in India people would just, in those days, just have a nice blanket or a rug or a durry or something and sleep on the floor with a nice bolster. But for European use, everything was elevated off the ground because they didn't want to kneel to look into their chests or, you know, be on the floor in any way. And then equally, you know, in the V&A, there were these beautiful watercolours. So one was of a lady who was sitting on an Indian lady sitting on a European chair, but instead of having her legs dangling and her feet on the floor, she was squatting on the chair in her usual posture. And then somehow I found this other watercolour that paired with it very well, which was of a European gentleman lying on a carpet, trying to adapt to Indian culture. And he was sort of smoking a hookah and leaning against a bolster, but he has his shoes on the carpet, which was a real no-no, you know. You just would not do that. So it's those sorts of slippages, lack of understanding, loss of translation, that's what I was trying to get across in those objects. Sort of partly through my experience, but also partly through just visiting churches, mosques, interiors, looking at furniture in different cultures and bringing all that together in a sort of hybrid way, and then using those to sort of extrapolate. I took 3 of those objects, the black ones, that were sort of, in a way, I feel that when I'm working in that way, it's so free that all those references come together in quite a natural and intuitive way in the objects. Whereas if I stop to think about it too much and try and make a larger singular object, it becomes a bit contrived. So all the intuitive stuff happens in that very direct way in the studio. And then what I did for this project was to take 3 objects from there and then work them up on a larger scale. And that was quite a difficult, frightening process because I was quite aware that it could look quite contrived, that you're just taking one object and you're enlarging it. But then, of course, there was that change of materials and a different way of making and, and a different aesthetic quality to the work. I think... Is that enough?
Yeah, I mean, they're great. I mean, I didn't know that they were extracted from those sketches, and I'm absolutely fascinated about them. I mean, they're so ambiguous and immediate, and, you know, and they I don't know, do you see them as sketches as well, or they are...
Yeah, sort of. I mean, I suppose initially I didn't see them as sketches, so I've got a long history of making these small works, which are very intuitive, and I think with this body of work, I did feel that I wanted them, so I very consciously worked with ornament in these pieces and thought about furniture and micro-architecture and objects that could either encompass or hold the body. So going back to your question, there is an element of holding the body there, yeah. So, so I was very conscious of making sure that those elements were incorporated into that work, but again, in quite a sort of intuitive way. So what I did was roll out sheets of clay, really cover them all in ornament, somehow impressing the sheets, putting them away, and then just randomly bringing them out and working with them so that the ornament was already incorporated in the clay. And then it becomes a very incidental part of the work in not in a preconceived way.
Ingrid.
I was going to ask you to talk a little bit about how you installed the exhibition, because there was quite a lot of conversation about how much work to put in. Yeah. And it is a very full exhibition. It's got a lot. For a small gallery space, I've seen people spend a very long period of time with the work, much longer than we often have with our visitors. Yeah. And it feels to me that the work has moved in. You know, it's there, it's moved, it's sort of, it's occupying the space and kind of going back.
I think she wants to know when you're going to take it out.
Yeah. And it feels very at home in the way that work can exist in the studio. Yeah. You know, this idea about filling the space or filling the shelf. And it's sort of, to me, in a way, it almost sits between a gallery installation and almost a public, more of a domestic or private encounter with the work, like you might have in the studio. And it also made me think about the use of the shelf and how that might relate to ideas around the still life and how the still life exists in art history as a way to casually, seemingly casually, but actually very formally arranging things in this way. And because there's references to furniture and still life and shelf, it seems to be that it's moved in is the way furniture or objects might sit. I think it's incredibly brave to put that much work in the exhibition, where there's so many different conversations about material, colour, process going on. But you've really made it work, and I think that the piece between the aperture, between the two spaces, that physically links between the lagging piece, that physically links the two galleries, just emphasises that yet further for me. So. Sorry.
Well, do you know what's quite interesting, Ingrid, is that I had, so with my friend Michelle, I made a small model. Yes, this is Michelle here. Yeah. I made a small model of the work, and it's the first time I've ever had to do that. I've never had an exhibition where I've had a whole gallery to myself and been able to plan something. And actually, I felt that we didn't actually have that much of a conversation, Ingrid. I know we talked about all the work that was going in, and you kept encouraging me to make more and more and more. And I think I felt quite nervous about about curating this show and how professional artists, and I mean I'm a professional artist, but I suppose I feel like it's my first venture or my first step.
I'm a really unprofessional artist.
Well, it's the first time I've had an exhibition like this in a space of my own, and I was very nervous about what the protocols were and what was aesthetically acceptable. And obviously I'm quite obsessed with this idea called horror vacui, which means feeling fear of empty space and wanting to fill everything, but also aware that it's quite an Asian tendency. And I grew up on a market stall where working on a market stall and having, my parents had a clothes shop, and we were encouraged every Saturday to go and dress the window and put as much into the window as possible. It was the days before mannequins, so you had to do all that sort of stringing bits of clothing on invisible string and, and composing in that way. And so I sort of didn't really want to go in that direction. And, obviously, I always feel in between these two ways of doing things. So I wanted to have a very spare and serious looking presentation, but I had so much work, and Ingrid was encouraging me to put this in and put that in, and also it felt like a great opportunity to just show the new work as well, because it was I was very aware of the fact that people had only seen the ceramic work, but also that the doorway presented such a great opportunity to do something site-specific that it just came quite naturally. And then even on the days that we were installing, I just thought half of this is going to have to be put in the garage at the back of the studio. But actually, somehow it just all fitted and worked very nicely. But I have to say, I didn't give art historical ways of presenting things any thought whatsoever. It was just, I think it's all that, I feel, my education was in crafts, which was very much about how to make things. I slightly leapfrogged over art history, I don't know how, and suddenly have landed in the art world, and all those references are I feel, I might have taken them in sort of subconsciously or subliminally, but I can't talk about them, and I've just got a different way of doing things, which is actually through experience, through personal experience, hence the reference to the shop in Accrington.
which is actually a beautiful image, even if you can't see it. I have to say, can I just pick up on Ingrid's thing about the still life? I will. I know I'm hogging this, but hey. I think that the still life is a great reference, and some of my favourite paintings of all time are still lifes on simple shelves of just, you know, a Zurbaran, 5 vessels on a shelf. I mean, they have a whole world in them. My other shelf reference is to the kids' bedroom in Toy Story, which is, again, it's just crowded with brightly coloured toys, and that's equally good for me. Sorry, please.
Well, I mean, I think it's a fantastic show, so thank you for that. I really, really loved it. But I was just picking out some thoughts following on from what was just being discussed about still life, and that's something about it's not domestic in any way, and yet there is a sort of sense of a space one could live in almost, you know. I think there's a scaling and something about the shelves and the doorway and the things on the wall. And then I was also thinking what you were saying about your childhood, and you've talked a bit about cultural background, but it seems that there's an economic background, that you grew up in a class background as well. And I wondered if you could say something about that, whether that has played through in any way.
Yeah, definitely. It really has. I feel that, right from the beginning, I suppose being from a sort of socio-economic background where funds were quite limited, I think, you know, the choice of course that I decided to go on. So I leant towards craft rather than fine art because I thought I could possibly make a living from ceramics, which is
big mistake.
Deluded. So that was the start. I mean, I think, I mean, in a way there were sort of positives and negatives. My mum was a seamstress who sewed from home, so it just meant that we all helped, and it did mean that I generated quite a lot of good dexterous skills, so I was always good at making things. So that was the positive, but also it just does mean, you know, you're constantly having to make choices between work and making a living. And I taught for 20 years in a college in Tower Hamlets to earn a living, and then also that shift from making gallery-based ceramic work that was very embedded in the world of craft, which I feel that you can only really be a successful craftsperson who doesn't teach if you've got a private income. You know, I think in that was the time that I was working. Whereas now things are different. I think with social media, you know, and Instagram and so on, that might have changed. But so I felt that I had to get out of that world, and that's why I started to work to commission. And then, of course, so that started off quite well, but of course then as soon as I had a child, and you know, that was another thing to negotiate, and so my availability to be able to work on commissions was really reduced, and luckily working from home meant that I could manage, you know, I've got a studio at home, so I felt that I could just, you know, and my husband is also works from home, so we were able to juggle childcare, and I could carry on working on public art projects, and he's always been very supportive. But over time, you know, as more and more of my time got taken up with teaching childcare, the quality of the projects dwindled because I didn't have time to apply for interesting projects, or I didn't have the energy either, you know. So that all sort of dwindled, and then it was eventually I made a decision to give up my teaching, and it was a very long delayed decision because I couldn't, it was our only income source and our only regular income, and so it felt very dangerous and risky, but actually it worked out somehow, because what I did, I took time off from my, as soon as I stopped teaching, I got a slight payoff when I left teaching, and I used that money to develop a new website. And I've always had really amazingly supportive friends who've, exchanged work, and so I had a friend who helped me design an amazing website that spoke to architects to enable me to get architectural work, and then slowly that sort of work, that developed, enabled me to develop the architectural projects again. And then quite quickly afterwards, actually, I was encouraged by other friends to apply for the V&A residency. And I think that really changed everything, because then I met Amrita, my gallerist, and then I think from that point, everything changed. But it did I feel like I've been working for 30 years to get to this point, and it's quite often been hand to mouth, apart from the last 5 years. So yeah, and I think that's because I was I think when David and I were chatting earlier on, I felt as though that it was something that I that I had to mention, being what it was to be. I think quite often people ask about the difficulties of being a woman artist, but I feel that before that, there's also wrapped into the equation race and class that people quite often forget about. And that's something that I've really had to deal with over the years.
Nick?
When you asked about the body, it was interesting. You said there's no real relationship with the body in the work. And when you do talk about the work, you stress the architectural, and you talk a lot about furniture. And I wondered if you're more comfortable with sort of ignoring the body because of your Islamic background, and what the relationship between the pattern in the work and traditional Islamic artists. Where how consciously you refer to Islamic sources.
I mean, I have to say, I grew up in a household where there was no trace of the body, apart from maybe some African figurines. But then over time, even they disappeared. So,
No trace of the body apart from the commode.
I suppose. I suppose in terms of representation, right. But you're right. There is a relationship to the body, because the furniture-based, the wooden sculptures, they're all about the body and how they're in terms of their scale. Because I wanted to make objects that you could relate to physically and almost think about ways of inhabiting them, because previously I'd only made small objects that you had to mentally project yourself into and think about, and decipher, say, for example. But so I suppose the push was to really try and make objects that you could physically engage with. So there is an element of the body in that sense. But I haven't really, I think I've never really, I mean, I was always rubbish at life drawing at school, so I sort of felt as though I veered away from any representational work quite early on. And there was always this sort of natural tendency towards working with technology. I wanted to be part of the technological world and wanted to be so-called modern and using new technologies and new materials, and that's what I was much more interested in. And referring to the body seemed to be sort of taking me back into an art history that probably wasn't really mine. It's not my art history, or it's not something that is part of my sort of inherited culture. So so I sort of really felt no connection with that.
Good. I'm being given a sign by Ingrid that we probably need to wrap up, unless there's an incredibly quick question, which would then precipitate an incredibly quick answer.
Okay.
But I don't have it.
Well, my question is, because I've heard you talk a lot about culture and your background, is what lesson do you wish you'd been taught at a much younger age?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Do you know what? I feel. I think I've gone through life. I think this whole exhibition is about erratic behaviour and veering from one thing to one mode of being, or one set of aesthetics, or one art history to another, and never really sort of wanting to. So I suppose it's partly about being compartmentalised, but also it's about also being accepted. You know, which field or which area would you be more accepted in, and sort of adapting to do that slightly through the work, and also through my own behaviour. So I think it's much easier to say this now, because we're living in a very different world where people are much more culturally aware and we live in a much more globalised world. But to just, I know it sounds really corny, but just to sort of, just to sort of not really think too much about what other people are expecting you to do, or how people are expecting, or organisations or institutions are expecting you to conform or to be. So I feel that I've gone on this sort of long trajectory to come back to where I am, and feeling just about okay now about being who I am, you know.
Perfect. Words to finish on. So I'm just very brief. Can I thank Lubna?
Thank you, David.
Ingrid and everyone from Peer who's helped, and your good selves for coming. See you again. Bye.